Well, where does the Isle of Man sit in the constitutional situation, especially, of course, with the UK? And that's come up recently. Well, Professor Peter Edge is joining us now from Oxford, and this is your thing, constitutional businesses, and the interviews you're going to be doing, or the panel you're holding here in the Isle of Man with PAG, is called the Constitutional Conundrum. Over to you, Peter, because we are different, aren't we? No one knows quite sure what the Isle of Man is and isn't, so I'm sure you got an answer.
Yeah, we are, and always the Manx Constitution's in a state of flux. Things are always changing. So, if you looked back 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you'd have quite a different view about the power of Tynwald versus Parliament, the proper hands to have control of executive government in the Isle of Man, loads of things like that. And a lot of what I do is looking at those incremental changes. So, we had a big change quite recently where the Chief Minister stopped being elected by Tynwald, and the next Chief Minister will be elected by the House of Keys, which is quite a significant change, but it's a fairly concrete one. What we're going to be doing at the PAG meeting is try to talk about some of the really big possibilities in terms of constitutional change. So if a country decides to actually create a constitution, what does that mean? What does it look like? What sort of decisions do there have to be? So not the incremental change that we see year in, year out, but those moments when a country, when a political group says, actually, it's time for us to think about what we do and come up with sort of a more codified way of approaching these things.
Okay, now what about recently when there's this talk of the UK having the power to override Tynwald, also the Channel Islands? I mean, we hear these constitutional issues which haven't been around since probably the Radio Caroline issue for us. How do you read this?
Well, in absolutely strict law, my view is that Parliament can legislate for the Isle of Man, just as it could legislate for New York. The Imperial Parliament, the UK Parliament, has always claimed very, very wide legislative powers. But there's no more reality to that than saying that the Queen could decide not to sign an Act of Parliament that came to her validly. There's the legal rules and there's the Constitution in practice, the way it actually works. And so I think what has happened has been that some of the UK figures who are pressing for compulsory legislation binding the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, not only without their consent but against their consent, are focusing on the purely technical, the theoretical powers, and not actually considering about how the constitutional relationship has evolved, certainly since the mid-1970s.
So will the Isle of Man get or need a proper constitution, an actual written out one, agreed with other parties?
Well, you see, this is where it gets difficult. If the Isle of Man had had a written constitution established in, say, 1860, it would be very clear, and it would have locked the Isle of Man into a particular set of relationships with the UK, particular understandings about where power should be exercised within the Isle of Man. One of the great strengths of the sort of unwritten constitution the Isle of Man has and the UK has is that you can have evolution and change without it being a very formal process. But if we reach a point where, because of the constitutional turmoil in the UK generally, there is a move for the UK to have a written constitution, that might seem a very natural moment for the Isle of Man to reflect upon having its own constitution, which connected with that insofar as the Isle of Man and the UK connect.
Should we be worried, though, if that sort of came about? I mean, the imperialists over there, do they want the Isle of Man back in the Channel Islands, make it simpler, if they got complete control over us?
It could be a very difficult constitutional moment, but there is an ultimate escape clause for the Crown dependencies.
UDI?
Which is independence.
Yeah, right.
And really that becomes a matter of deciding, what is best for the territory in question. So actually there's quite a lot of economists and political scientists who think that the current relationship is really favourable for the Crown dependencies, including the Isle of Man. But if it was to change a position which was back to, say, the mid-19th century era, when the UK and UK government would routinely be involved in governing the Isle of Man with that as its central focus, with the UK interest as its prime focus, then I think that becomes quite a different conversation, really.
Okay, well, it's going to be obviously a fascinating discussion. You're paneling this in the Isle of Man. It's Monday, 7:30, PAG meeting, and everyone, I think, can turn up and enjoy what you're going to say. And you're looking for input as well from people there, maybe?
Yes, there's got to be very, very little, the three of us standing up and talking at the front, and lots of room for discussion. And there will be a panel of three of us. There's me, who mainly is a sort of a Manx constitutional historian and constitutional law person, Professor Claire de Tan, who has similar expertise in relation to the Channel Islands, and Paul Beckett, who has a particular interest in routes to independence.